with folks? Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I know that we have a pretty large crowd here today. This is also the first meeting the first official meeting with all of the new agencies, though I know because it's summer and vacation time, not everybody was able to be here. First, I just want to see if there's anybody here from the public who wants to make any comments. Anybody? Anyone? No? Okay, great. Like I said, this is the first big official meeting, so attendance is going to be in a different order today. So please let me know if you are here. Ram.
Here.
Linda.
Here.
I know you're here.
Oh, here. Did I not?
No, Patrick.
Oh,
Oh, I'm here. I am
Okay.
here in California, and I'm here.
Ajit.
Here.
Peter.
Here.
Lauren is not here. Dan is here. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
Yeah, I'm filling for Lauren.
All right, great. Jan.
Here.
Rachel.
Present.
Trina.
Good morning. Here.
Susan is not here today. And Jen. And Maura.
Here.
Rob.
I'm here.
Great. Okay, cool. So we're not going to do introductions just yet because most of the people who are here are part of the technical upgrade planning group and they're later on the agenda. So we'll introduce them later. Scott, do you want to share the slides? Share your screen?
I do. Give me one sec.
Okay, cool. So updates. For the annual calendar, there isn't much that has changed. I did include the West Ed request as having been submitted because at the time that we were updating the slides, they said that they were planning on submitting it that day. So that is not quite accurate. The MOA for the CSCU labor data request 26, the MOA has been signed for that. The data sharing agreement for the Yale pre-K lottery outcomes is still in the works, but hopefully we'll have that signed and up and running by the time we have our next meeting. Are there any other data requests that people are aware of that will be coming in?
Hi, this is Linda from CCH. We will be having a data request for income data that we will send our client information and match income data. We'll have full specifics on that, but that will be coming soon.
Awesome. That's great.
The question, Katie, did you say the 26 was completely signed? I know we just sent ours in this morning.
I said it was almost signed. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I misheard. Okay, no problem.
If I did say it was completely signed, I apologize. It is almost signed, completely signed. All right. So that's what we have for data requests. As always, please share any that you know. Yeah, Ajit?
Okay, we have one in the pipeline, or it's almost done. It's going to be submitted. It's about special education students and their special education graduates and looking at their post-secondary and employment outcomes. I know we do the remediation one, but this one is for special education students, and it also looks at employment outcomes. We used to do a survey in the past, but we're moving to, the response rate was horrible, so we're moving to use P20 Win. We're using NSC as well, but we need wage outcomes as well for these students. So this will be an annual thing that will come. We're just finalizing it, and I know Chuck's been discussing it among data stewards.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Just a question on that. Is it involve CSCU?
I would think so.
Because I haven't had any communication from Chuck on it.
Okay, okay. So maybe he didn't mention it, maybe I thought he had, but my understanding is that it involves all the higher eds.
Okay. I haven't
But
seen it.
okay, but definitely wage outcomes, that's the key, because that's something we don't get from NSC.
Okay, so if we don't hear about it before the next data steward meeting, we'll just include that. We'll make sure that it's on the agenda for that meeting.
Jeet, is that the same as the IDEA reporting? I think we logged it here that we're expecting something in August.
Yeah, it's the IDEA Part B indicator 14. When they speak their jargon, that's the language they use. Yes, that's the one.
Okay, awesome.
Actually, I take that back. I don't think we're gonna do the post-secondary. I think it's just going to labor.
You're just getting it from the National Student Clearinghouse, then that would make sense.
I think we'll just use the clearinghouse for the post-secondary stuff because we're not really looking for credit attainment, remediation, that type of thing here. So I think it might just be a wage outcome because that's the gap we have here.
Okay, great. Any others? If not, we can move on to the legal agreements. So I want to apologize for sending quite so many emails over the last 2 days about the EMOU and its appendices, but they have been they've been completed. We've circulated it among all of the members of the Data Governing Board, and thank you to those of you who have already sent us back signed documents. So we have more than 2, so it's technically effective and official at this point. And our deadline, it would be great if we could get all of the signatures by next Friday, August 6th. And if there are any issues or if that won't work, if that's not feasible, please let us know so we can coordinate and figure out an alternative deadline. Okay? Yeah, Jan?
Thanks. So I have a question. The new EMOU supersedes all the prior agreements, which would have been expiring in September anyway. What I'm wondering about is the other documents that we use for operational purposes, the templates. Are those also then superseded by what's yet to be developed, or are we still able legally to use the prior ones, even though the new agreement supersedes the old?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the document itself. Like for example, the attachment to the data sharing request form is not a legal document, so I think we can continue to use that, or even have different formats for that. I mean, it supersedes the existing MOAs, it supersedes the board policies, but some of the documentation that goes with the request is they're not legal documents, as I understand it. We could check with the council, but I think we can continue to use and modify the formats for those if needed.
So it would be the DSA on down is not technically a legal agreement that is then affected by this? if that's the case, then that makes sense, and that would be potentially workable. I just want to be sure we're clear about what we can and can't use.
I think maybe the folks involved in the Yale request, this is a good example. The DSA is a legal agreement, but like the attachments, the appendices to it, those could vary based on the nature. So like the Yale request has an additional transfer of data from one of the school districts. And so like that's a modification to that legal agreement. Data sharing agreement is still a legal agreement, but you can, modify the attachments, the appendices to kind of as needed based on the nature of the request.
I think what's throwing me off is we don't have a data sharing agreement that I've seen, a template agreement for the system or for us. So that's what's throwing me off. And we can talk about it at another point if now is not the right time. I just, I think it's important, as we have the requests coming in, we know what documents we can and can't use.
So we're planning on having meetings to go over the subject matter specific data sharing agreements in the next couple of weeks. So, so those are coming. They are just in development right now.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other comments about the legal agreements?
This is Patrick. I'll just note that our commissioner's been on vacation. I have as well, so I haven't seen any of the emails that you sent the last couple of days. I assume we'll be able to make the August 6th deadline, but I'm alerting you that I'm not sure how much is going to be piled up on the commissioner's desk when she gets back on Monday or on mine. So we may or may not get to this by August 6th, but we will definitely try.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know.
We're in the same position, Katie. Beth's out, and I didn't realize the deadline was impending for next Friday. We can have someone sign on her behalf. I think Sarah's approved everything in terms of legal, so I don't think there's any reason why she wouldn't sign.
Okay, great. Okay, so moving on, I will throw it to Scott for a sustainability conversation.
So I'll just give a quick update and then kind of an ask to the group for this. So at the May executive board meeting, one of the topics we put on the table is the planning for sustainability for P20 WIN. It's a responsibility of the executive board. And so they had a brief discussion to begin thinking about that. We set up a small working group of wonderful volunteers to meet over the summer and discuss this. I'm a little behind in kind of convening the working group, but we had a good discussion earlier this week about this to eventually develop a sustainability plan for P20 WIN, which is something is obviously necessary for the system and is a grant requirement for the SLBS grant. So we're trying to meet multiple goals by putting this together. We want to identify potential funding sources, whether they are through state budget, grant funds, project-based funds, seed revenue, different sources that can help sustain and eventually expand the kind of work that P20 WIN is doing. The discussion we had was looking a little bit at the sustainability. There's a sustainability plan framework that NCS distributes through the SLBS community, and the first components of that framework are really trying to understand the key stakeholders who need to be involved in thinking about system sustainability, and then focusing on the use and really the value kind of that's come through the system with the notion that, in order to sustain the system, we have to be able to kind of demonstrate value to a wide range of stakeholders, particularly stakeholders with some kind of control over the funds that would sustain the system. So I put here kind of the three questions. This is trimmed down a little bit from the SLBS Sustainability Plan Framework, but there's three questions here that they ask people to focus on about stakeholder support, who should be involved in the planning process and in the system as a whole, looking at the use of the system so that you're ensuring and tracking kind of widespread use of the data and the results from the SLBS, and then looking at return on investment for the system itself, being able to document examples where the system has yielded some value or provided some benefit to some key stakeholder. And So this, we can follow up kind of offline, but it would be great if people have suggestions, now to make sure that we're reaching the right set of stakeholders. And if there's examples or documentation that you've got sort of within your agency or kind of kept from the past of where P20 Win has kind of been helpful, then we want to make sure we're keeping track of those. And that we're really attributing those to P20 Win, because I think the system does not always get the credit that it deserves. Since Patrick is on the call, I'll just he gave an example this week where one of the studies on career and technical education that used P20 Win data was on the front page of one of the local papers here this week, which is a little surprising because the study's from a couple of years ago, but it didn't attribute it to P20 Win, but this is a good example of reinforcing to people like, hey, this system is the one that's producing, the data that goes into this study that's giving you important results about the value of career and technical education. So when there's examples like that, the more we can kind of keep track of those and document those, it helps to develop the sustainability plan. So I just wanted to put that kind of on the table as a marker that we are, looking closely at the sustainability for the system. We will come up with a plan sometime later this year. But as the first component is just understanding the stakeholder groups, who should be involved in looking at system sustainability. Anyone that we're not talking to that's kind of not part of the agencies here, and then examples of where P20 Win has yielded benefits in the past, so we can point to those and demonstrate the value systems providing. So if folks have suggestions either on stakeholders or examples, if there's something you've got that's documented, you can send along. That's helpful. We have, I know on the website, what we kind of transitioned from CSU last year, there's good examples of news clippings and documentation, studies, reports, white papers that reference P20 Win. And we can send the link to that afterwards so people kind of compare and contrast. But I'm sure there's things where it's yielded benefits that we're, not keeping track of. And that's, I think, what we want to make sure we're on top of. Any suggestions on stakeholders or examples of benefits? And I think more around Patrick for the folks who are in the discussion. If there's anything I'm missing, please let me know. Hearing nothing. Can't see the chat if there's anything in there, but so we'll send out the link to the existing set of resources that we have on the site now. If you see gaps in that, updating that is something I think we want to do to make sure that we know when P20 Win data is used and referenced. All right. Moving on.
Next up is the technical upgrade recommendations.
You got it. Great. I'll just keep the floor for this. So I think another process that we are going through for P20 Win is looking at the technical infrastructure for the system. So I think as stepping back sort of generally, I think folks are aware for the SLDS grant that's supporting the expansion of P20 Win had a big focus on research and a big focus on the technology and the technical capacity of the system. And so just as I think we set up research planning groups last fall, we wanted to set up a planning group for the technical upgrades to just make sure we took a look at how things are being done, where, if anywhere, we needed to make changes or upgrades to the system. And so we had a very, I think, robust planning process with a group focused on technical infrastructure that ran from February through last month. And I'll go through the members, and it would be great to have people say hi in this meeting, because it's a contribution from a wide range of very people with a lot of expertise and insight to offer. So we wrapped up the planning process and are going to present, I think, a draft set of recommendations today, also through entirely my own fault. We did not circulate the draft recommendations with enough time that I think they have achieved consensus and full support from the members of the technical upgrade planning process. So just to be transparent about that, I think we're considering these still as a draft. And for the data governing board today, I think is a discussion to see if the recommendations kind of generally make sense, and then which of those we need to focus on revising or editing, and then planning for the executive board meeting that's in 2 or 3 weeks if there's anything that we feel needs to go and be escalated to the executive board for further discussion or attention. Because that's a good opportunity to make sure that they're aware of the process and the key components of it. I think not everything that's coming out as a recommendation is probably relevant at that level. Most of them don't require policy changes of any sort, but that's kind of the framing we want to have today is, to make sure that the members of this group have a rough sense of it. There's a memo that we're drafting that has more detail on these, and we can send that after the meeting, but we want to make sure you have at least a first pass at these, opportunity to ask questions, and then we will move them forward kind of based on your guidance. Planning group members, so many of whom, everyone was invited today, and no, not everybody could make it, but many of you are on the call today. This is the list here. So from a lot of the agencies, it's a mix from the kind of data stewards group, the data governing board, and then based on sort of recommendations about handling this kind of process, we made sure to bring in a couple of outside voices with expertise in technical infrastructure. And so I'm particularly grateful for the contributions from the folks at DAS Best. So we had Mark Raymond, the Chief Information Officer, Dave Lavadia, Director of Application Services, and Deb Sengupta, Director of Enterprise Architecture. I think, Dave, you're here today. I know that Mark is out, and Deb, I think, had a conflict. But just particularly grateful for contributions from them. And then we had Vicki Beltry, the Director of the Office of Health Strategy, who sort of run or administer the state's all payers claim database and the health information exchange, which are also sort of active areas of development. And so having her and some of her team in the discussions, I think, but they're folks who are not intimately familiar with P20 Win. And so I'm grateful for everybody. I'm particularly grateful for the folks who do not have a direct stake in P20 Win, that they're willing to devote a fairly substantial amount of time and expertise to this process. I don't know, Dave, if you're here. Vicki, I don't think is able to make it, but we had a wide range of folks, and I'm just grateful for everyone's time and contributions. Through the goals we had for the process are reflecting basically the implementation of the grant goals, which at a very high level are to expand the P20 Win membership and accelerate data use. So the membership is expanding, as Katie said at the beginning. This is the first real meeting with the kind of 10 agencies at the point where they're signed on to be sort of full equal partners in P20 Win. So the expansion is happening. We have other agencies that are exploring onboarding and continued expansion. And then accelerating the data use, I think we are seeing, even in the discussion when Katie talked through the annual calendar, there's 3 or 4 requests kind of in the pipeline. And so the number of requests and the rate at which they're going to come through, I think, will accelerate, particularly as the new agencies come on board. And so then the focus is on how to expand and accelerate data use for the system, looking not just at technology, but at the intersection of people, process, and technology. And then the grant kind of asked us to focus on the following areas: adding the new data sources from new agencies, building analytical and data matching capacity, and being able to execute on the research agenda and the corresponding tools that are part of that. So that's what we tried to cover. The general time frame for the group was a series of monthly meetings from February through to the present, essentially. So we had a kickoff meeting. We met with external data requesters to kind of hear from them about the experience of making requests to P20 Win and to other similar systems in different jurisdictions, so we could have a sense of what the users of the system expected. We went through 3 use cases with sort of different degrees of complexity to illustrate different parts of the system focus. And then we had a wrap up and report out at the end of, or very beginning of July to come to the data governing board today. And then, we'll see what, if anything, needs to move forward to an executive board meeting in August. We can always, hold these for a future meeting, but this is the schedule we've kind of had in mind, is that we go through a series of 6 meetings, produce recommendations, meet with this group, revise the recommendations based on your suggestions, in this meeting and after, and then take whatever we need to forward to the executive board. I mean, this we saw in May. So in May, the Data Governing Board, we presented the sort of current technical infrastructure, and I think I will skip over this unless anyone wants to kind of pause on it. But this is describing what we are doing today, at this exact moment in the primary areas that we're focused on. There's the transmittal of data, movement of data from point A to point B, the matching and linking of data by Department of Labor across agencies, privacy and security through the system as a whole, tools for analysis and visualization, and then the request management process, which involves technology, but is, I think, a little more human-centered process. So we just went and documented what we're doing today, and then so we know the systems and the people and the processes that we're reliant upon. And we put this is, I think, worth a little bit of discussion. And I know in some of the learning sessions, we've talked to other SLDS, we've talked to Rhode Island, New Jersey, and I think we'll bring in some other peer states to just kind of hear from what people are doing. But we wanted also to situate what Connecticut is doing in a national context. We had our TA consultant for SLDS provide kind of guidance throughout this process. And we were able to meet with some other folks who do kind of work on SLDS and integrated data systems nationally to situate what P20 Win is doing. And you can see some of the national trends for SLDS. This is what we had presented to the group in, I think, February, increasing public-facing aspects of the system, continued expansion of SLDS, particularly beyond education and workforce into social services, health, juvenile justice, which is exactly what we're in the midst of here. And then what I think is a real focus for P20 Win is really trying to align the agenda of the system with the state and the agency's policy priorities. And so that's critical both for sustainability, but also, for the value that I think everyone gets out of participating in the system, the ability to see it, directly influence policy in the lives of Connecticut residents. And then part and parcel of that is looking at tools and the sort of advances in technology to be able to have a sort of more mature system than we have now. And so, what we have now, I think, is working, but we know with more agencies, more data requests, we need to take a hard look at what, if anything, needs to be done differently. And so these are the 5 draft recommendations we produced. I'm going to, before going through these, and I know most folks have not, Data Governing Board members, most of them, not everybody has seen these yet, so we'll talk through them in a sec, but I just want to pause if there's any questions on the process in general, national trends, or the current technical infrastructure before we go into it. And again, I'll pull up the list of the planning group members to thank them for their time. Anything from the planning group members, is there anything anyone wants to just offer about the process, something that you observed or learned through it about what we should be taking a look at? Group. Okay, great. Go to the recommendation. So this is a draft subject to revision from the guidance from this group. There's 5 recommendations. I'm going to go through these in slightly different order. A few of these I think are more straightforward, and then one of them is like a little more in-depth. And so we had an extra slide to explore that in a little more detail. So I'm going to go in kind of reverse order here. So one of the recommendations, again, this is a draft, so subject to folks' feedback on it, but one is to formalize an advisory role for someone, representative from DSS. DSS is, for folks that I think don't know, is the state IT agency, and again, having the state CIO, 2 of the directors directly involved in every single meeting in this process, and and a handful of kind of side discussions to get ready for it and debrief afterwards has been invaluable. There's no formal role for anyone from BEST in P20 Win. There's not a participating agency. They're not part of the governance process, but it's something that yielded concrete benefits during the process. I think folks remember that we had a discussion about the encryption for the data transmittal a couple of months ago. That was able to move faster, really through a lot of combined effort from Department of Labor and BEST. But that's a concrete example of an improvement we were able to make through the BEST participation in the process. learned about project management tools that we're testing out at OPM, again, through their guidance and expertise. So one recommendation is to kind of keep that strong relationship going and formalize kind of an advisory role for BEST, presumably on the data governing board, pursuant to the support from BEST for this, but so that it's something that's not ad hoc or, that's just, we're calling it an emergency. It's something where they're sort of like actively part of providing advice to the system. It's a different role than the participating agencies or the operating group role, but to provide advice and, guidance as we look to expand and accelerate data use for the system. So that is a no cost recommendation that can be done fairly quickly, but that again, the contributions from that team has been invaluable in the process, and we wanted to try and find a way to build a more formal relationship. The fourth, but second is to develop an incident response plan. This is something we do not have and we need for the system as a whole. So this is, I think, hard to disagree with. I think, as again, more agencies become involved, complexity increases for the data requests. We need a way to respond to potential or real incidents that threaten the security of data. And that is a process that I think is something we can go through and, there's a playbook that we can draw from. In 2 weeks, we have a learning session with Jeff Brown, who's the state's chief information security officer, who I think is an expert in this kind of approach, and so we could talk with him about this. But this is also, I think, a fairly straightforward recommendation, something that we lack that we need to put in place as an incident response plan. And then I'll go through the third here is one thing we heard particularly from the kind of the data requesters and the customers is that the process of requesting data is time consuming and in some cases a kind of a headache. And there's little things that we can do to streamline and ease that process. It can never be entirely automated, but we can smooth out some of the bumps in the road. And through the discussions with the data requesters, review of some other sites, and we saw some sort of demos of interesting tools for this during the technical upgrades. It seems like it's 3 different places where we could streamline the data request process, which really falls to OPM to manage that process, but having an online data request form so that there's a form that people can fill out that is easy to access. Everybody gets the same, kind of form up front. We can have a data dictionary that is a little more dynamic and allows us to generate some of the other documentation that we need for the data request process. And so there's some, I think, slightly better examples out there. We have an Excel-based form, which is perfectly adequate, but some of them could ease the request process a little bit. And then I think actually based on the discussion we had earlier, generating data sharing agreements from templates, based on the interaction of multiple different legal frameworks at this point, we will never have a single blanket data sharing agreement. We will have a template baseline data sharing agreement that we'll have to modify based on the legal frameworks for the different data requests. And so generating that in a way that is efficient, both for, in this case, for OPM and for the agencies who have to review the requests is kind of an open question. So these 3 tools we identified as things that could help to streamline data request process. There would possibly be some cost to some of these. Some of these could be low cost or no cost, but we have to explore the kind of market options for them. But these seem like the areas that are pain points where technology might be able to provide the most support.
Hey, Scott.
Number 2. Yeah,
Scott,
Rob.
It's Rob. I just have a really quick question.
Okay.
Do we currently have a customer-facing website that explains everything that P20 Win does and perhaps has some of the studies from previous years or things? I know we talked about not releasing everything to the public, but just examples of some of the things we've done. And I'm just curious if that's something that we should discuss or if we don't have it.
We have it, but it could use some love and attention, I would say. So we have there's a public-facing site, which I think Katie put one of the links to in the chat. So, which we transitioned again last year to the state content management system. So it lists, every data request, all the members of these meetings and so on. But we could probably do a little work to digest it and make it easier for the layperson to navigate. It's documentation heavy at this point. But if you're, like, for example, a legislator coming in it's hard for you to know where to look or kind of how to find something. So that's, the material is all there, all the, the data, the reports, the analysis is all there. We just need to make it a little easier to navigate. Does that get into your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sure. All right. So I was going to skip number 2. Thank you. And then we'll go to number 1, the data transmittal. So I think, as I mentioned, both DOL and BEST made a concrete, improvement to the tool that we're using now, which is Axway Secure Transport, to transmit data between the different agencies and the data recipients. So that's a change that we've made, during this process that improved security for data transmittal. But the agreements that we're entering into now hold us to a higher standard for maintaining, logs of the files received, the matches conducted, the when data was transferred, to whom it was transferred. And so having some of that documentation, I think we need to either take a close look at the extent to which the current solution can support this, or if it can't, either modifications that would need to be made or looking for another solution. But the language here is the same as what's in the enterprise agreements. And so this is really, again, somewhat non-negotiable. This is a requirement that the application, or somehow we need to do this. So if it's a person or technology or a process, some mix of those, but make sure that technology can support as much of this as possible. And so the application we're using now, I'm going to see if it can do all of these things, and if not, make modifications where needed. I think one thing that use cases that we looked at through the process demonstrated is that there is a lot of transmittal of data from different agencies to Department of Labor, to the data recipients, and that, again, as we manage more requests, have more agencies as part of individual requests, then we looked at one request that was, I think, 5 or 6 agencies involved simultaneously. So at this point, you're talking about, tens of different files moving for a single request. And so we want a system that really has that kind of lockdown and look at the application we're using, figure out if it meets the requirements that we have for, particularly for audit and notification, not least of which, but that's so we'll go into recommendation 2, which is a little more in depth in a minute, but I'm going to see if there are questions, particularly from members of the data governing board or the folks in the planning process, anything you wanted to add in about recommendations 1, 3, 4, or 5.
I could just add a little historical context for 1. The logging has just been, it's done, but it's, at least I did it, but it was done manually. So that's still, it's always a backup. I understand that automating is always more efficient, and especially as things become more complicated. So I just want to let people know this isn't brand new. It's just about developing a better way to be more comprehensive and efficient about the logging of this information.
And this is Fred. In regards to number 3, another thing that the group had talked about, at least briefly, was identifying data standards for certain common fields that might help streamline some things too, as far as the analyses go.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a general, sort of generalized also opportunity from this process, and that's something I think the data stewards had like a good discussion about earlier this month, last month, recently, and so I think that's, yeah, this is a good point. More agencies, we'll see more consistency, or it's an opportunity to get more consistency. We'll send out, I don't know if there's anyone else waiting to speak, or we'll send out sort of there's a sort of written up memo that we circulated earlier this week that folks are editing with a little more depth on all of these. So we'll send that out kind of after the meeting, and you can kind of grapple with these in a little more depth. So just want to make sure that if, particularly for 1, 3, 4, and 5, if there's any questions, concerns, objections to these before, again, we start kind of documenting moving forward on these. Some of these will have potential, there's policy changes. If we were to add an advisory role for DSS, that's a change we would need to make to the governance. The incident response plan, I think, is probably low cost or no cost. Any changes to the applications or different tools for streamlining the request management have potential cost implications. There's no real policy changes for these, but I think, like Jan said, I think we can do some of these things manually. It is good if there's technology that supports that, or that we can use manual as a backstopping to the technology. And so either way, people or technology, they both cost money. And so I think there's potential implications for 1 and 3 to cost implications. We don't have hard numbers on those yet. Anything other questions, concerns, for 1, 3, 4, 5?
Well, back to 4, obviously we need one, and I guess when you said it's no cost, I think you mean that the cost of developing it would be nothing. But I mean, obviously it depends on what it says, and we need to figure out what it's going to be. So who will be responsible for developing that plan, and how is that going to happen? I mean, that's a really important component of this that isn't really fleshed out at all, other than we know we need one. So yes, we do.
Yeah, I think that's right. So for the plan itself is, the sort of in-kind contribution of folks, and we're, I think, hopeful we can get the expertise of the DSS team on this. The full memo has like a little more depth on kind of how this would be undertaken. We can look at different examples of it, but the responsibility for it really is going to fall back on, I think in this case, OPM and Department of Labor, because of the roles that we have for the system. But we'll need, I think, insight from DSS and then from the other participating agencies to get their information security staff if possible. So I think the first marker is to say we have to develop this plan, and then lay out a little more detail about how that would get done. And then I think you're right, there could be cost implications to the implementation of the plan, but we don't know that yet. Give us more specificity, that helps.
Not only to the implementation, but if there ever was a breach, this is Rob again, obviously for the participants, we might have to supply them with some kind of I know we do at the Labor Department, if something were to happen and a breach were to occur, we provide individuals with the ability to have their identity protected through other means. So I'm just saying, like identity lock or something like that is what we implement, I think, at the Labor Department if there were a breach like that. But that could be costly. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Other comments on these 4 recommendations? I don't hear any objections. More clarity.
Scott, Ajit here. I know we talked, I had to step away for a second. I don't know if we discussed the second point.
That's the next slide, because that requires more depth. So I'm going to click to that. It was a good segue. Did you want to say anything on the 1, 3, 4, and 5 though?
No, no, good on those. Thanks.
Okay. So this, again, we'll send the sort of full memo sometime after the meeting to the data governing board members, because you have it with a little more depth. This is the kind of PowerPoint version of it. But I think, again, I'll just speak to sort of my understanding of it, but I'd welcome the folks in the planning process to kind of give your point of view on this. I don't know why the numbering is wrong on the slide. Anyway, so one thing, we walk through examples of data requests. We looked at the current sort of multi-year request for post-secondary outcomes. We looked at a hypothetical request related to juvenile justice data. We looked at the pilot that DSSers are currently underway implementing on integrated care for kids, as just concrete examples of what data is required, what would have to happen for this request to kind of be fulfilled and move forward. And all of those requests involve, because of the nature of the system now, involve substantial movement of data, The turnaround time that we have now for requests is long, so it's it's several months, but no part of the process itself is time consuming. It's the it seems to be the case that it's just there are a lot of steps in the process, and so the whole thing takes a long time, even though the matching the data does not take that long, filling out the request form does not take that long. No part of it takes a long time, but when you add up all the different pieces, it's sort of several months for an individual request. So it is both a sort of heavily manual process, and it's a process that by the nature of it involves a lot of movement of data, and that is an opportunity to tighten up the security for how that is done, and to possibly find efficiency in the request management process. And so we put forward what I think of as two recommendations. I think there's a third sort of piece that kind of goes along with either of those two approaches, but they're two different approaches that other SLDS and other sort of more broadly from the world of integrated data systems have pursued, but two options to reduce the movement of data and to increase security and improve the request management process. So one option would be looking at ways to further automate within the federated model that we're currently in, and there's two or three things that I've highlighted here that are ways in which that's done in other sites, and these are not mutually exclusive. They can all be matched with each other. You can do all of them simultaneously. One of those would be API-led integration, so that there's some way to sort of automate the transmittal of data from the transmitting agency to the central integration hub. That's something other SLDS have done, and is actually, I think, part of the definition for a federated model from the feds. A second thing that can be done is the development of standardized extracts from the participating agencies, so that requests don't require going back to the source system to pull data. If something is part of a regular ongoing request, that the extract is kind of ready to go for that. If there's a frequent or commonly requested elements or fields. And then another thing that could be done, which I think goes to some of the elements of the incident response plan as well, so these all interact. Some sites have also looked at having the removal of the primary identifiers before transmission. This prevents the use of identified data, but if you're working with de-identified data, that it is de-identified before any data is transmitted, that puts a little more burden on the participating agencies to go through the hashing or the removal of the identifiers before it's transmitted, but that's a way to ensure that you're never transmitting identifiers with the data. And so any of these three are ways to kind of automate further within the federated model: use of APIs, development of standardized extracts, and removal of identifiers before transmission. So those are consistent with the current model. It would potentially increase security and improve the throughput for the system. The other option, which I think folks have kind of has had in the back of their mind for a while, is looking to transition from the federated model to a hybrid system where not all data at all times is centralized, but commonly requested, frequently requested data is managed centrally, and then other data are managed kind of ad hoc by the agencies themselves. So it's a hybrid of the centralized and federated approach. And that's something, again, you can see the chart on the right-hand side. The SLDS survey of sites came out in the last couple of weeks, and most SLDS have a centralized system. That's the plurality, I guess, within the universe. You can see 20 sites have a hybrid system, and then we're in the federated bucket with about 18 sites. And so that's the national landscape for this. So it is neither a rare nor a new idea, but it's an option, I think, that we have that gives the agencies still control of their data, but when data is frequently requested, rather than repeating the transfer of the same data elements time after time after time, that it's centralized and managed there. I think these are sort of the main two options. The third one here, which for some reason is number 4, is looking at a credentialed user model for staffing, which is really, I think, what we are doing through the support for the SLDS grant, where all the positions now, I think, are envisioned that they can work on requests from multiple agencies. And the sort of principle here is that rather than the data moving, the people move, and they are appropriately credentialed kind of wherever they go. And so that's a way of addressing some of the security concerns through staffing model, and I think that could be applied to any type of system. So I think for us, the discussion I think is mostly on either options to automate within the federated model, or the potential for transition to the hybrid system, which again I think is on a voluntary basis for frequently requested data, but is worth discussion. I will pause there. Questions, suggestions, thoughts. Again, members of the planning group or the data governing board, this is hopefully reflects the discussions that we had, trying to digest a long series of discussions and meetings into concise set of recommendations.
Hey, Scott, this is David. I was just, is number 3 inclusive of the concept around, creating a data lake, data warehouse, sort of data analytics platform for everybody to share work within, like kind of moving along the people move, not the data move? Is there anything in here around kind of creating a unidirectional data movement of the source data into this sort of analytics platform, where then aggregate data or summary analyses can be performed and not worry so much about moving that data back out towards consumers? I know we had talked a little bit about that, but I was just curious, and I'm not being clear, just asked me to rephrase, but really creating that sort of centralized data warehouse of sorts for these types of requests that have, to your point, credential-based users could then come in based on their own individual needs and access rights to be able to do the work that they need to do without the data having to go back outbound prior to analyses.
I'm going to give a short answer, but then I want to see if I can prompt you to describe why you're asking that question, because I think it's been really valuable to have the kind of perspectives from people outside the system, but who do this kind of work every day, to sort of why you're thinking about why you're asking this question, based on kind of what you've seen through the discussion. The short answer to it is yes, but the hybrid system is kind of, again, there's a longer definition from the Department of Education that it's in the memo, and I can send that. But essentially, it would be sort of centralizing a portion of the data. So identifying the data that's frequently requested and centralizing that portion of the data that is rarely requested or has specific security concerns, or that the agencies just do not wish to centralize for whatever reason, that would remain federated. So it's again like a hybrid between centralization and federation. And again, you can see from the chart that a lot of SLDS have sort of landed in that place where they said we end up transmitting the same data time and time again. So let's just put it in a central place where it can be managed rather than going through the transmittal process, which is both time consuming, to some extent risky from a security perspective. So it's a hybrid of that centralization and the federation.
Okay, yeah, I think that answers my question. I just think the benefit of reducing the number of instances of these data sets through a centralized data storage model is an ideal that we should push towards, so that you don't get this distributed results sort of output of all the work that these teams are doing throughout this workflow. You could imagine that the data destruction policies for something that moves out of the analysis phase and into the distribution phase towards 3 or 4 different consumers, it becomes much harder to sort of just wrap your arms around where that data lives. So the idea was, multi-data source, bring the data into a central environment whereby you then perform your analyses and hopefully some sort of normalized or anonymized results that then could be distributed out of the system, but you're kind of keeping all the sensitive data in one place while you're performing those actions. So that's what I proposed to Scott as a long-term objective, I think, for this group. I think it would be beneficial for everyone involved to move towards a singular place to work. So that's all. I just want to make sure that we were considering that in this view, but you've mentioned that it's in part of part 3, so I think I'm happy there.
Ajit, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. So I think there are serious concerns about centralizing personally identifiable information. So I would have strong objections to that. not because of security or anything, but because of the message it sends to the public that the state is tracking individuals across agencies. It's one thing to do it for one-off studies, but it's another thing to start building that longitudinal data warehouse database that says, yeah, we know where everybody is and what's going on through the system. Because I think, A, that requires new legislation and new ways of doing business, but B, I think initially, I think it sends a very different message out to the public, because we've had tons of pushback to these types of, to P20 Win in particular, but anytime you centralize PII, I think it's a major concern. But that aside, I am totally willing to explore this standardized data extract idea. We've talked about this in the past, where we do move sometimes similar data for different requests, which, so from that standpoint, if we were to say, let's build a repository of de-identified data, we still do the matching the way we do it, but it's then sort of this massive data set, but it's relatively de-identified. Again, I say relatively because to me it's still secure data, because there are ways in which you can drill down to an individual, even though you may not have name, but you can get to an individual pretty easily. But it's relatively anonymized, relatively de-identified, and it allows multiple folks to ask different questions of that data. So you don't start with the question and then go get the data, as much as let's figure out the common questions, the common data, let's match them, and let's set up a store that you can use for different kinds of analyses, so that we aren't moving data every time. So I'd be willing to look at, and I don't know if Scott, if that's what the hybrid means, but I'd be willing to look at that instead of storing PII from all different agencies in one place. Do I make sense? I don't know if it makes sense.
Ajit, I think I completely agree with you there. I think I'm looking at the workflow. There was already creating a central environment for that PII, right, at DOL doing the matching. So I think the idea there was, could you create a place even for that work to take place that was secured, and then the results of that work is also kind of put into a secondary centralized area, right? So the PII already exists in a centralized workflow, because everything comes into that matching routines, and the exports of that then get distributed out to the requesters to then do whatever they want with it. But I think what we realized was that there's some ability, if you were to find that source identifier table that, say, got created with that data set that got sent in, you could do some reverse matching algorithms to say, okay, because I found the source file and I found the results file, I can do my own reverse engineering and figure out who these people were. And to eliminate that, just trying to eliminate the number of times that the results were sent to many places. So I'm in 100% agreement with you around PII in multiple places, but it is today, right? In all of your individual source systems, you have that PII. So it's like,
Well, may I make a comment? Sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Sure.
Bad. Our current process actually is not that the PII is persisting in one place, and there are in current processes, I'm not sure they're followed everywhere, but if they are, there is a disconnect between the PII at the agency and the identifiers that are used, and they do not persist. They're to be destroyed. They're not to be retained. But I agree with you that there's still risk in terms of the frequency with which sometimes we're repeating similar processes, and there's definitely room for improvement. So just a point of clarification about our current process. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. It's helpful. Scott, that's probably all I had to add.
No, thanks, Dave. And I think to look kind of Jan's comments too. So this is where, again, like these are draft recommendations. We have a memo that has a little more depth. One lesson I perhaps incorrectly learned for technology is that everything is possible. And so it's just understanding, the requirements. And so like having a hybrid system without the PII centralized, yes, that's possible. And so, I think kind of understanding what the boundaries are for folks. And I think to one of the points that Dave alluded to is like what the status quo is. I think that was a lot of lessons learned. Oh, my screen just died. Teams logged me out.
Ajit
Anyway,
has
the
his
meeting,
hand raised again.
So,
oh, okay.
thanks, Katie.
My
So
screen is
the only suggestion I would have, Scott, is,
Yeah.
we're all talking from images in our head about how this stuff works. We have a lot of people who are part of P20
Yeah.
Win. I think it would help to have visuals to talk about current state and the hybrid state, so that we could show visually how, if we went to that hybrid state with standardized data sets, like how we would actually reduce the number of movements of data, and how do you determine what goes into that standardized data set. I think it's doable, I really do. But it would be helpful to see the visual so that we can illustrate, PII just moves once and it's matched. Data sets are generated, PII is destroyed. PII isn't moving every time there's a request. Like it would be helpful to sort of see that visually. I think that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's good homework. I know we're over, so we'll see if there's any other comments. I'm going to give myself a tiny bit of credit. They're very beautiful PowerPoint slides that the group saw that have some attempt to map out the movement of data for requests, but it's kind of imperfect. But yeah, I think today we're not sort of presenting the visuals for that, but that makes sense, to just understanding. I think it took a while for everyone to understand, like, here's how the data is moving for these requests. But at least it took me a while. So, anyone else before we wrap? Sorry, we're over. I lost the slides. Oh, there you are, Patrick. Here.
Yeah, I'm here. My Wi-Fi is, I'm in a hotel room, so who knows how the Wi-Fi here is going to work. David had the issue around want the data moving too many times, and I appreciate that. But I've always, my big concern, and I think this is where I want to totally agree with Ajit. We need to see a visual, because my concern has always the data being in two places at the same time, and particularly with regard to updates, and suddenly you're not in sync. So I would love to see the visual that Ajit has requested.
Yeah, all right, that makes sense. All right, more PowerPoint slides. We'll send the memo. I'll modify it a little today to put some of the visuals in it, I think. And we'll go from there. If there's further, once we send the memo, I think if there's further, it's more in depth, and so it'll give you a little chance to digest. And if there's more comments, feedback, then please say so, and we'll modify accordingly. Katie, there's nothing. Oh, there was one more item in the agenda.
Yeah, but I can follow up with everybody via email about the executive board meeting agenda. But the meeting is on August 17th, so it's coming up quickly. And so with that, we can wrap up, I guess. Thanks for staying over, you guys. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Scott.